I am delighted to welcome you today to our interview. Jonathan Barnes, you're a visiting senior researcher, you're a visiting senior research fellow at Canterbury Christchurch University and a national teaching fellow. Cherry Tufik, you've been a potter for 50 years, and now you're both working in Canterbury and France, but you've also taught in East Africa and Malaysia, other parts of the world. And you've both been teaching, and we're here today to talk about Jonathan's remarkable book, Positive Pedagogy Across the Primary Curriculum. I think it is a masterpiece. It's just extraordinary. It's a spiritual guide. It's a love letter to teaching, and a blueprint really for how we should be growing a community in the globalized world. So useful. So this is something that's going to I think live on my desk, which I can keep referring to throughout my teaching career, I hope. Tell us why you wrote it.
Wow, it's such a lovely introduction. Thank you. I wrote it because I'm really worried. And I'm worried that education is going in a way that is becoming less and less humanized, less and less responsive to the fundamental humanity in all people. It's becoming more and more instrumental. It's becoming more and more to do with competition and targets and things that are, for many children, quite negative things, and for many teachers, quite negative things. Throughout my career as a teacher educator, I've interviewed maybe about 3,000 people who wanted to be teachers, and I'd say maybe 70 or 80% of them say that they want to be teachers to make the world a better place in some form or other. And the things I see in education at the moment, I don't think are making the world a better place. And so I've really hit on this idea of looking at how to make the experience of education more positive, more affirmative to the humanity in people, and more of a way of building that humanity in community and in a kind of global sense too.
Wonderful. And you start the book by asking what core knowledge is, critiquing it. Could you maybe say a couple of words about that?
Well, quite a lot of writers, especially in America, have been very, very concerned with core knowledge and deciding that there is a kind of whole list of things that every child should know. My experience as a teacher, and Jerry has found the same all the way through, is that core knowledge is a different thing in different societies, in different ages, in different cultures. And that apart from the basic ability to deal with language and to deal with communication and to know the basic survival skills of being human, core knowledge is something which is actually discovered within community. It's not something that exists as a separate thing in my mind. Of course, we have to teach kids reading and writing. Of course, being able to handle number is necessary, but those are not really vital. They are vital. They're not really the only thing in education that is important. They are important, but so much more about being a human is things that will give us some sense of hope for the future. And I think that is a really important thing that education should be thinking of all the time. What builds hope for a future which is very uncertain and quite worrying for many, many people.
And to backtrack a bit, so the reason why I've asked you to come along as well, Cherry, is because although Jonathan's written the book, he's authored the book, he thanks you in it. And I think it's beautiful. his thanks to you, and it really acknowledges that the work does not get produced in a vacuum, and great work is always collaborative, whether or not it is acknowledged. And so the conditions of production, this is something that feminists talk about a lot, and how usually ignored or invisible the work is that goes takes place all around the thing that is visible. So I just wanted to ask you why you supported Jonathan in producing the book. And also because I know the wonderful work that you both do. I mean, Jonathan, you're an artist also, and you create together or in conversation. I wondered if you could say a little bit about the secret to sustaining such a creative life within a relationship.
Well, first of all, I think we have to be good friends, and we are. So we've liked each other and been together for 50 years now. So that really helps, because we understand when there are moments of stress and moments when we have to be quiet. I'm not so good at understanding that. But moments when we have to support each other and listen to each other. And I hugely respect the work that Jonathan does and his writing. I think he's terrific at it, so I want to be there to help him. So if I can help do the other things that are needed in a home as a couple and as parents, then I try and do some of that while he's busy writing. I also like working in the same room as him, and so we do that together, even though we're doing different things. We bounce off each other quite well. So if he needs help with an idea or a sentence that's got jumbled, then I try and help to unjumble it, and the conversations that ensue are really interesting too. So that sort of thing.
I'd say more as well about the fact we almost always have adventures together which have a kind of educational side to them.
Absolutely. We've just been to Burundi together and worked in a school together on completely different things, but we've had such interesting conversations every day about how it's affected us and how it's actually changed us as well. So that's been another thing to be able to do and talk about afterwards.
And we've been able to do that really all through our lives. We've been fortunate to live in India and to live in Malaysia and to have lived for long periods in Africa. And those are absolutely transformative experience for both of us, both educationally and in our relationship, I'd say.
And to be able to build connections between our experiences in different countries with different people, help with everything that we do, so we can often make links towards other things that one or other of us has forgotten to include in something.
Yes, I've always thought that the most precious thing about family is that they are sort of the archive of your stories, not they, of your life, in a way that nobody else is. Nobody, even if you tell them that they haven't had that experience with you. And this leads to another question I had about when you write about humanizing the curriculum and the importance of stories. I wondered, Cherry, whether you could tell us a little bit about that and perhaps give us an example of how you use stories in your teaching in the environments that you would go to.
A lot of my recent teaching has been about communication. I've worked in a special school where communication was the most important thing. I taught through music. So I was the music coordinator, but this wasn't about playing a violin nicely. It was about encouraging children to communicate together through sound, whatever the sound might be. And often it's wordless sound, or it's just noises, or it's eyes looking at each other, smiling, showing approval, showing enjoyment, showing sadness, showing whatever. And recently I've been working with various different groups, from adults right down to tiny children, to special children, to musicians, working with basic figures made out of clay. So I've got some examples here of these basic figures, which are just heads with noses or eyebrows or whatever, and how they can communicate together. So what we do as a teaching group is to have children make simplified versions of heads, which are basically just cylinders with some feature which defines them as a head. And the most important one that we've discovered is a nose. You can then, when you've done that, work in groups together and set up these as small communicative groups. So perhaps you could have an adult and a child, and depending on where you position the adult and the child, you can set up what might be a social situation or a double situation where perhaps this adult is speaking to a child. Is the child feeling happy about this? Is it a male or a female child? Does its colour show its ethnicity or its social background? There are all sorts of questions that you can ask using these that develop vocabulary and understanding and just the use of the word list. So, for instance, this one over here, and children are encouraged to make these little scenes together. So these two are perhaps having a secret together. And this one here is feeling whatever he might be feeling outside the group. He might have taken himself out of the group. He might be happy about it. He might be unhappy about it. Eventually they might let him in, or he might feel that he can come and join the group as well. So you can see how something really simple can be used, first of all, for manipulation, for making things coordination, and secondly, for social situations like this, and to increase vocabulary and have a bit of fun as well. So that's basically what I do.
I think as well that the fact that the children have made these characters kind of gives them an ownership and a commitment to the conversation that wouldn't be there if you'd given them dolls. I mean, I don't know if you...
Well, I think you're right. And I've now forgot what I was going to say. The way to extend this is then perhaps to make little stickers by the characters, so it's saying what they're saying to each other, and then that could continue in a language setting to making up a little play, so that they could become the people and set up situations, the sort of things they might say together. And sometimes when you're working with what you might call a puppet or something that isn't you, you're more able, or a child is more able to express themselves, because they're not actually expressing it as themselves, but as the characters here. So they can say things like, you really upset me today, which they perhaps wouldn't say to each other in that sort of way. So they're useful on all sorts of levels, really. And I use them a lot at the moment.
Fantastic. You mentioned the word wordless, and I wondered, perhaps, Jonathan, you could say a bit about that, since you talk about it in your book.
Well, it goes back to one of the things I was saying at the beginning. Things have become so kind of instrumental that for example, in primary schools, there's less and less creative writing, and much more, huge amount of focus on just grammar and just the rules of grammar. And so what happens is that even with worded things, the words sort of lose their meaning. It's just the sense of, is this the right grammar? Is this a fronted adverbial or not? And so on. And that trend over the last 20 years, I'd say, has meant that a whole load of the things in the arts, especially in drama and music, in art, in sculpture, in dance, have almost been abandoned in primary school, so that those things are much, much less common than they were when I started teaching. Those wordless ways of communication are sometimes the only effective way of communicating that children have. And for really quite a large percentage of children, those wordless things mean something much more fundamental to them than words themselves. The ability to express in color, the ability to express in sound and communicate. We've both seen, haven't we, even in children that cannot speak, are really heavily meaningful and heavily satisfying in terms of making connections with other people.
One very good way of explaining that is that when I was working in special school with music, I had a class full of maybe 10 children, one of who was a non-verbal, non-ambulant child, would be put onto a board that was slightly raised off the ground so the child could feel vibration through it. The rest of the group would sit around and tap out a little song on the board as it was going around. So it was a kind of collaborative exercise so that everybody could do that together. the child in the middle would become often excited and interested in what was going on completely around it, and therefore would make some utterance that wouldn't be a word, but would show pleasure or sometimes fear or enjoyment. All sorts of things can happen, and therefore some noise is produced by the child in the middle. And the children on the outside are encouraged to reproduce that noise. So therefore we'd be making up a little composition, a musical composition between us, out of basically the sound from the child in the middle that's amplified by the child around the edge, which gives the child in the middle wonderful agency over his surroundings and pleasure and beliefs that what he said was of value. And that was just the most lovely thing to be able to do, but totally without words, just through vibration and collaboration from everybody.
So that's an extraordinary example.
A lovely thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and that's beautiful as well, because it links that child with exactly what Picasso was doing. That it goes right through humanity, that business of wordless communication and the pleasure and the importance of that.
Which we all do all the time without calling it, don't we?
Yeah. Well,
Body language, yes, all of that.
I mean, this example really brings to life the connection between creativity and happiness to learning. And you talk a lot in your book, Jonathan, about the importance of happiness to learning and the importance of an emotionally positive space to activating learning.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I suppose I've observed all through my life that when people around me recognize something that they do as creative, and sometimes that's to do with me saying it's creative and me congratulating somebody, but sometimes it's just the pleasure of seeing that when you put this and this together, you've made something that nobody has ever made before. An enormous amount of pleasure comes from that sense and from reminding yourself or reminding another person that what they've created there has never been creative before. And maybe in their age group, or maybe in their group, or maybe literally ever. But that sense that probably only humans have, because of their ability to kind of look in on themselves, which is pretty well advanced in the human species. That sense that we can change the future and change things, it is enormously happiness producing. It makes us feel somewhat valuable in a way that other things may not. And so that's where the thought started. But increasingly, I've noticed that when children are fully engaged in something, when they're fully engaged in thinking about it, being curious about it, putting things together and so on, those children begin to develop that sense of happiness which is visible. They're happier to be close together. They're happier in terms of what their forehead and underneath their eyes look like. They're happier in terms of the things they say and the relaxation of their body language. Their shoulders go back, their heads go up. You get all these physical signs of happiness. And I often ask teachers to look for that group of things in a class. It's not always like that. And some children can show happiness in very different ways. But look for the signs of happiness constantly, and in knowing that individual child and the way they show their happiness is crucial to that. I don't know if that's an answer to the question.
Yes, that's brilliant. It's brilliant. You say something in your book about happiness. I think it's about happiness. So there's a beautiful term you mentioned called eye sparkle quality, which I had never come across before. And as I was reading it, I thought that's exactly what I see in my students at university. This is possibly not just limited to primary school children, but it's you see a visible change in their eyes when you're talking about something that's really meaningful to them. or more often when they're talking about something that's meaningful to them. Could you tell me a little bit about this term?
Well, I mean, the term was given to me by an Israeli academic. I was at a conference actually in Canada, and he just said to me in conversation after something I'd presented, yes, I see what you mean. I always look for the ESF. And I said, what's the ESF? He said, the eye sparkle factor. And of course, instantly, I knew what he meant. And instantly I was able to make that connection, which I really believe is universal, because I've definitely seen it in children in India, in Bali, in Malaysia, in Japan, in Ethiopia, in Burundi recently. And the same, it doesn't matter where you are. When a kid is really engaged or really fascinated in something, their eyes sparkle. You can see it in their eyes. And it's again another example of this wordlessness. There's so much in the body and the face that can show us what's going on in the mind of a person. I even remember it. I just remembered just now that I also taught in prison. You know, I was teaching with people whose crimes were awful crimes. And I was doing art with them, history of art, and the fascination that these prisoners were showing in really quite abstract art and talking about its meaning to them. You saw the eye sparkle factor. You saw that sense of, yeah, I'm really engaged in this. And that's why I believe all teachers should look for right the way through, not just teachers, but, think of nurses, think of social workers and so on. These things are human ways of saying, yes, I'm in the right place. Yes, I feel satisfied, happy, fulfilled in what I'm currently doing.
Values. Your specialism is in values. I believe you wrote your doctoral thesis on it.
Yeah.
And this really interesting discovery that you mention in the book is that where an individual teacher's values, where their personal values match up with the values expressed by the institution in which they work, they're far more likely to remain engaged with the institution and to stay longer in work. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it's so relevant, I think, not only to primary schools, of course, but to secondary schools, to universities and workplaces.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I've been working on now for 20 years. Whenever I do staff development anywhere in the world, I do the same thing. I ask teachers to draw around their hand, and I ask them to think of the 4 or 5 things that kind of drive them and focus them and give them a sense of meaning, their values. I define a value as something that is a deeply held belief that acts as a prompt to action and a kind of destination for their actions. That's the kind of definition I do. So I ask them to do that. And I ask them to do it in Ethiopia, I've asked them to do it in Japan, and so on, regardless of the age of people they teach. And unsurprisingly, I find, a huge correlation across the world with teachers. I guess I'd find the same with nurses and social workers. People want to be kind. They want to be generous. They want to be welcoming. They want to be communicative. They want to be compassionate. These kinds of words come up all the time. And then when I've dug a little further, firstly within a British context, but later again all over the world, I found that when people worked in institutions where those values aligned with their personal values, the things that drove them, actually aligned with what the school said, then they gave more, they were more committed, they stayed longer, and they felt continually satisfied. I interviewed for my own research 9 people of the same age as me and said, what sustained you in education? And it was that alignment between their personal values and the values of the institutions they were in. If the values didn't align, then they either have nervous breakdowns or they left. They or were deeply unhappy staying and were able to give less and less. So that sense that values are important really, really stuck with me. And then I began to realize that actually the context of education, the values context of education, was possibly the most important thing to draw education together, to make sense of education. So that sense that education wasn't just about stuff or about core knowledge or about what you thought core knowledge should be. That education had to be something which was within a bigger umbrella of let's make the world a better place, a bigger umbrella of let's make all the people in this classroom or this seminar group think about compassion and what that means in everyday life. That kind of thing. And those conversations, those dialogues that again can happen from 3 years old right up to 100, are the things that give learning meaning and learning a direction of learning and a complete purpose for what you're doing. It's not just about accumulating a load of facts, but facts and knowledge and skills within a wider paradigm.
You've been the head of a primary school, and I know there'll be other heads watching this video, heads of institutions and people responsible for managing a workplace. What are some practical ways that they can make sure that this matching up of values takes place?
Well, the first practical way is having the values conversation often, literally every month, literally right the way through the year. About, number one, most schools now have a set of values, but most of them, I find, are fairly nominal. They're just up on the wall and they don't really mean that much. There might be an occasional assembly or something, but have the conversation. If, for example, compassion is one of your school values, how does that apply to your ordering of paper for the photocopying machine? How does that apply to the conversations in the corridor? How does it apply to the awkward parent? Those things. And so taking those values and talking about them is important to keep them alive, but also, of course, staff change and situations change and everything else, and you need to continually think about whether those values actually mean anything. And values also lived values actually act as a kind of policeman. In my school, we had the value of belonging. That was one of the things we chose, that we wanted every child and every family to believe and feel that they belonged in this place. And that belonging, could be applied in a geographical and a historical, a scientific and a language sense. And parents would come to me, you say belonging is important. My child doesn't feel they belong because of this, this, and this. And it gave us a focus as a staff to address that. If we say belonging is important, it's got to be important for every single child. And so the idea of a value as a policeman is something that I would put absolutely first in terms of the hint. Second is the sense that the curriculum, regardless of whether it's PE or RE or science or maths, must respond to those values. So if the value is belonging, how does PE help a child feel a sense of belonging? How do the skills of geography get turned into something that explores the idea of belonging, and so on? So both frequent conversations and curriculum application, I'd say, are the two things I'd say. And I believe this: the older I get, the more radical I feel. I feel that it's in the interests of those in power to keep the power within quite a small group of people. So, for example, when I go to independent schools, like my son Ben teaches in one, I see all those things that I'm asking for. Huge interest in the arts, huge interest in music and drama in particular in his school. A relationship between the teachers and the kids that is actually much more equal and less authoritative, strangely, actually more humane in almost every way. A care for the lives of the individual and an interest in the different ways that individuals think that is almost airbrushed out of state education. And I wasn't that much of a political animal 20 years ago, but by the time I'd finished headship, I became very political because I saw the way that official education policy was actually constricting the experience of most children, and really only selecting a number, maybe 20% of children who actually fitted a very narrow definition of what the educated was. And that's shown particularly here in Kent, of course, with 11 plus. It is 20% go to grammar schools and the others don't.
I wanted to ask you about this just extraordinary example you gave. The example you gave of a year 3 and year 4 class in Sussex who were responding to the arrival of a boat of migrants on the shore near their school, and the incredible transformative effect that positive pedagogy had on their understanding, their processing of that event, not for themselves only, but also for the wider community.
It really was a seminal moment for me. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it was the talk of the town, because not that many boats of migrant people arrived in Hastings, where it was, and the experience, the positive experience started actually with an artist. So the artist we had asked to come into the school and work on the whole business of refugees, and she got the children to make little origami boats, the simplest bit of origami possible. So they were all making the boats, but on those boats, on one side, the children had to write a relationship like sister, friend, mother, brother, sister, and so on. On the other, they had to write a message to the migrant, or of welcome to the migrant. So I some message, and 2 classes in year 3 and year 4 did this. They went through this process. Number one is the children were massively engaged with it. The artist was immensely kind of sympathetic and gentle with the children, and also very committed to the idea of welcome and protection that could come. She communicated that simply through her being, without actually having to say very much. The children did that. And then the children, when I asked the children, well, what should we do with this? The artist was going to make a big display of all these boats, and she put them on beautiful kind of transparent fabric. So there were hundreds and hundreds of them. And she displayed all the messages and promised the children that they would be put up in the town library or the town hall, which she'd already arranged. But then when I asked the children, what should we do about this? The children said, we think there's lots of words that we've used that are the same. And so the children decided that they would actually count the number of uses of the word welcome, the number of uses of the word love, the number of uses of the word peace or safety, and that kind of thing. And so they counted them, and they made a little table of which were the most commonly use words. And the kids were so proud that they'd actually done something with these hundreds of boats with messages beyond just the display. And so they said, we want to present these. And so they put all the boats in a big tray. They made graphs and everything. And then in assembly the next day, they paraded in with trumpets, all that they'd found, and then told the rest of the school what they'd discovered. So that, we deliberately gave the children a focus that was current. We deliberately gave the kids an opportunity to show what was in their hearts, because they could choose what they wrote, and they rose to it strangely in that kind of cross-curricular way. They made something mathematical out of it in the graphs, but also wonderfully artistic.
Yes, they collected it, but also collating it. So
Yes,
they turned it into they really collaborated.
Yeah. And in terms of the eye sparkle, that was everywhere. I've got some delightful photographs of the kids just beaming with pleasure at having made this transition themselves, that they had agency there.
And that really demonstrates to me how short-sighted it is to cut the arts and humanities out of curricula from primary to secondary to tertiary education. And it cuts out the heart of the community in a way.
Yes, I go even as far as saying it cuts out the heart of humanity.
It's interesting that you said that the older you become, the more radical you become, and you said that with a bit of trepidation, I think.
Yes.
And but did you know that the etymology of the word radical is root?
Oh, is it?
Yes, and so it really is about going back to the root of the problem and the root of community, and looking at what's underneath that culture and what holds it together.
That's interesting. No, I didn't know that etymology. But of course, as you get older, you become more and more determined to do what you think is right, and to leave the world in some way, in a slightly better place than you arrived in it. That's the sort of aim. And so I suppose it drives you back to those roots. And it's certainly in my research, those roots almost always happened between about 7 and 16, that kind of age group, where fundamental beliefs that act as a prompt to action are pretty well established. Of course, it can happen at other times, but it most often seemed to happen in those school years.
And so we need to keep that alive after school and in all our other spaces as well.
Absolutely.
Of course, within families and within workplaces.
Yeah.
So to keep having these conversations about values is most important, which really does come across in your book. Perhaps we can end on a happy note about food. You talk about the importance of food and its relationship to learning. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. Food being one of my favorite.
Well, I mean, the obvious thing about eating together, for a start, is a wonderfly human, again, totally cross-cultural thing. So giving, in any educational context, a space to eat together and to make food together, again, I feel is a kind of fundamental to humanity. It's something we as a species have as far as we know, have always done. There's bags of evidence going right back for that communal eating, communal cooking. So that's one big thing. Why don't we do more of that in school? Why don't we do more of what again happens in Montessori schools and in Steiner schools and so on? That sense of food being an important place of sharing and meeting. And that, for me, has kind of extended into things that I've observed in very diverse communities in London. The most successful educational approach to accommodating and celebrating diversity has been in a series of infant schools where people from different communities have brought food together to share, and they've taught each other songs from their own culture to sing before or after the food. So that business of sharing food across cultures has brought communities together, the very act of doing it. Equally, there needs to be, I think, education about food, because so much trash is eaten and has to be eaten by children in schools at the moment. Schools are providing breakfasts and meals at a level that I've simply not experienced in my life at all. The schools I go to in London right now are all running food banks. They're all giving breakfasts. They're all making sure children have a decent lunch, because they're aware of the importance of that food to learning. There's no two ways about it. So there is an educational imperative, I think, to teach about what foods are good and what foods are less good for our bodies and minds. And so, it's something really that I've only become fully aware of, I think, in the last 10, 15 years. But so important and so immediately relaxing. The moment you eat together, the moment you cook together, tensions go down. You get into that position of that state of flow that I speak about. Where ideas and thoughts and everything just flow very easily, and straight away your body is in a more relaxed context and more relaxed position. So food, yes, let's do more of it.